I was sitting in my neighbor's truck, 200 yards from my own front door, watching my son-in-law sign my name on a deed transfer. He thought I was 2 states away. He was wrong. My name is Howard Calloway. I'm 67 years old. I spent 28 years as a building contractor outside Columbus, Ohio, and when I retired, I kept my hands busy doing the only thing I've ever really known, building things that last. The house I'm talking about, the one my son-in-law Roland was trying to take. I built that myself starting in the spring of 1989, poured the foundation, laid every beam, mixed the mortar for the stone on the front facade. My wife Lorraine painted every room while I was still framing walls. We moved in 6 weeks before our daughter Nadine was born. That house has been ours for 35 years, and for about 14 months, I watched a man try to take it from us. The house sits on 1.8 acres outside Columbus. 3 bedrooms, double garage, and a workshop out back I put up myself in 1994. I do woodworking out there, cabinets, furniture, cedar chests, the occasional dining table. It's where I keep my tools and my records, and a few things I'll get to in a minute. County assessed the property at $520,000 last year. Lorraine and I had talked loosely about downsizing someday, nothing urgent. She's 63, retired school teacher, has some heart trouble her cardiologist calls manageable. I call it something I think about every morning when I get up before she does, start the coffee, and listen to make sure I can hear her moving around in the bedroom. Nadine married Roland Pruitt 9 years ago. He does commercial real estate out of Fairfield County, wears expensive watches, talks fast, always has an angle. I didn't dislike him right away. It took about 6 months before I had a clear picture of who he was. He was the kind of man who looks at other people's things and does math in his head. He did it at holiday dinners. He did it on weekend visits. I'd catch him glancing around the living room, the built-in shelves I made from reclaimed pine, the stone fireplace I laid myself over one very long November, and his eyes would go slightly distant, not appreciating, calculating. I never said anything to Lorraine about it. She had enough to manage, and I told myself I might be wrong. I wanted to be wrong. I wasn't. The first call came on a Tuesday evening in October, about 14 months before everything fell apart. Roland called around 7. I was in the workshop sanding a cabinet door. He made some small talk, asked about Lorraine, mentioned the weather. Then he said he wanted to talk about estate planning. He used the phrase protecting your assets, said he had a colleague, a tax attorney, who had helped several families transfer property to their children in a way that saved a lot down the road. Said he'd be happy to set up a meeting. I set down the sandpaper and told him I already had an attorney. Her name is Sylvia Okafor. I've worked with her for 18 years. She knows every document I own. Roland said Sylvia was a general practitioner and this required a specialist. He said it with the smooth confidence of a man who's used to people nodding along. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 20 minutes, then called Sylvia. She picked up on the second ring. I told her exactly what Roland had said, word for word. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Howard, do not sign anything. Not a power of attorney, not a transfer deed, not a gift letter. Call me first." I told her I understood. I went back to the workshop and finished sanding the cabinet door. Then I went inside, ate dinner with Lorraine, and didn't say a word about any of it. Over the next 3 months, I paid close attention. The pattern wasn't hard to read once I was looking. Nadine called more often, not just to check in, but the kind of calls that are warm on the surface and pointed underneath. She'd ask about the heating bills, mention how much work the yard must be at our age. She and Roland visited on weekends they'd never bothered with before, always bringing something nice, and Nadine was genuinely warm when she was here. That part was hard, because I remembered who she used to be before Roland got in her head. There's a photo on the mantle of her at 7 years old, standing in the workshop holding a hammer too big for her hands, grinning like she'd just figured out how everything worked. I've looked at that photo a lot over the past year. Roland kept circling back to numbers every time we talked. Property taxes, maintenance costs, heating a 3-bedroom house on a fixed income. He'd bring up Lorraine's health in a way that sounded like concern but landed like a prod. Like he was trying to make me feel that the house was a burden I should be relieved to give up. He never once asked what Lorraine and I actually wanted. Then in December, he crossed a line he probably didn't think I'd notice. It was a Sunday afternoon in December, cold and gray. One of those days where the sky looks like it can't decide whether to snow or just stay miserable. Roland and Nadine had come for a late lunch. After we ate, Roland said he needed some air and stepped outside. I watched him through the living room window. He walked to the edge of the back lot, near the property line where the yard meets the tree line, and stood there with his phone up, taking photos. Wide shots of the house, close shots of the workshop, the garage, the back fence line. slow and methodical, moving from one angle to the next like he was doing an inspection, like he was documenting something he already considered his. When he came back inside, he said he'd been sending pictures to Nadine's cousin, who was thinking about buying in the area. I nodded and said that sounded nice. Nadine was helping Lorraine with the dishes and didn't look up. After they left that evening, I sat in the workshop for a long time. Just me and the overhead light and the smell of sawdust and linseed oil that's been in those walls for 30 years. I looked at the main bench, solid oak, built it in 1997, floor-to-ceiling cabinets on either side, deep drawers running along the base. I looked at the false front panel at the bottom left of the base cabinet, pressed the 2 spots. The latch clicked. The panel swung open. The hidden compartment had been there since 1997. I built it during a stretch when I was doing a lot of reading about asset protection and thinking hard about the future. I was a contractor. I thought in structures and load-bearing systems and things designed to hold under pressure, so I built one into my own house, inside. A fireproof document box I'd updated a few times over the years. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of thing a careful man keeps around. The next morning I called Sylvia and told her to start the paperwork for an irrevocable trust. I want to explain what that means because it matters a lot to what came later. When property goes into an irrevocable trust, you're no longer the personal owner. The trust is. You can still live there, use it, nothing changes day to day. But because the trust owns it, any deed transfer, any attempt to sign that property over to someone else is void from the start. Not voidable void. It never legally happened, even if someone puts ink on a page saying it did. Sylvia filed everything correctly. It took about 6 weeks. By late January, the deed reflected the trust as owner. Roland didn't know, nobody outside of Sylvia and me knew. When we finished the paperwork, I told her I thought Roland was planning something more direct than just pressure, and I asked her to keep emergency injunction paperwork ready to file the moment I called. She said, "I'll keep it on my desk." In February, I updated the hidden compartment. I put in a certified copy of the trust documents, a recorded copy of the new deed, and a letter Sylvia wrote in plain English explaining that any deed transfer was void before it was ever signed. Not because of anything Roland did or didn't do, but because the property was no longer mine to transfer. I also added a prepaid burner phone in a waterproof sleeve, charged it twice a month just to keep it ready. Then I went to the hardware store and bought 3 small cameras. Nothing special, the kind you can get off the shelf, connects to an app on your phone, stores footage automatically. I installed one in the workshop facing the main door, one in the garage aimed at the driveway, and one on the front porch tucked behind the light fixture. All legal. My property, I tested them for a week and checked the angles until I was satisfied. My neighbor Clifford Baines knew about the cameras. He's been next door for 22 years, 70 years old, retired mechanic, the kind of man who shows up when there's work to do and doesn't make a speech about it. I told him what was going on, the short version, and he sat at his kitchen table and listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "You need anything? Call me." That was the whole conversation. I didn't tell Lorraine any of it, not because I didn't trust her. I'd trust Lorraine with anything. But she was managing her health, and I didn't want her spending her days bracing for something that might not come. I wanted to give her something real if the moment arrived. Not a plan described in the abstract, but the thing itself, already done. March came in cold. Roland and Nadine visited twice that month, and both times Roland tried to work the estate planning conversation back in. The first time I changed the subject to a driveway reseal I was planning for spring. The second time I told him I'd been thinking about it and would let him know. That seemed to settle him down for a while. He smiled and said no rush. Then, in mid-March, Roland called with what he described as a gift. He said he and Nadine wanted to do something special for Lorraine and me, a long weekend at a resort down in Indiana. A nice place, spa, good food, a real break. He said he'd already looked into it, had a reservation ready, just needed us to be available the second weekend of the month. Our anniversary is in September. I didn't point that out. Lorraine was happy about it. She started thinking about what to pack, asked me if the drive would be hard on her back. I told her it wouldn't be. I meant it because I already knew she wasn't going to be in that car for long. That evening, I called Clifford and told him what was coming. I told Clifford I wasn't going to Indiana. I was going to take Lorraine to his place 2 miles down the road, tell her I needed to delay a day for a supply delivery. And if a car he didn't recognize showed up at my driveway that weekend, I wanted him to call me immediately. Clifford said, "That son-in-law of yours?" I said yes. He said he'd be watching the Friday Roland drove us to the resort. He was relaxed the whole way, chatty, pointing out things along the highway, asking Lorraine about the spa menu he'd printed out for her. He carried our bags in himself, told us to enjoy every minute, said he and Nadine would be back Sunday evening to pick us up. He shook my hand at the door and told me not to worry about a thing at home. I watched his car pull out of the resort lot and disappear down the road. Then I went back inside, found Lorraine in the lobby looking over a brochure, sat down next to her and told her I'd gotten a call about a supply delivery. I needed to be there for Saturday morning. Nothing major, I'd be back by noon. She was disappointed. I could see it, but she said okay. I told her to get settled and I'd meet her for dinner. I drove straight to Clifford's place and got there just after 9 in the evening. We sat at his kitchen table, drank decaf, and mostly kept quiet. 22 years of being neighbors means you don't need to fill every hour with talking. The kitchen smelled like motor oil and old wood, the same way it always has. His dog slept under the table the whole night. At 9:47 the next morning, my phone buzzed on the table between us. Camera notification. Front porch, I opened the app. Roland's car turning into the driveway. Then a silver sedan I didn't recognize pulling in right behind him. Then Nadine's car. Clifford leaned over and looked at the screen. Neither of us said anything. I switched to the workshop camera, the angle that covered the driveway and the front door both. Roland got out first. The man from the silver sedan followed. He was carrying a bag, the kind with a shoulder strap, and he moved with the business-like pace of someone who had a job to do and planned to be done with it quickly. That was the notary. I figured it out before he even got to the door. Nadine came last. She was moving slower than the other two, hands in her jacket pockets. I switched to the interior camera, the one I'd positioned in the workshop, facing the window that looks into the kitchen. The angle wasn't perfect, but it covered the kitchen table clearly, my kitchen table. The one I built from a white oak slab I found at an estate sale in 2003, sanded and finished over 3 weekends that fall. I remember Lorraine standing in the doorway watching me finish the last coat and saying it was the most beautiful table she'd ever seen. Roland walked in and went straight to that table. He put down the folder he was carrying and opened it. The notary set his bag on a chair, pulled out his kit, laid a document flat on the table surface, and pointed to something near the bottom of the page. Roland nodded. He looked comfortable, like a man walking through a transaction he'd already completed in his head a dozen times. Nadine stood near the kitchen window with her back to the table. She was looking out at the backyard. Not at Roland, not at the document, not at anything happening behind her, just the backyard. I watched Roland pick up a pen. He signed my name, Howard Calloway, on a deed transfer for a property that hadn't been legally mine to transfer since January. I set the phone face down on Clifford's table. He looked at me. I said, "Call Sylvia. Tell her it happened." He made the call while I picked the phone back up and dialed the police non-emergency line. I told the dispatcher I had video footage of a man forging my signature on a deed transfer at my property right now, that my attorney was filing an emergency injunction as we spoke, and that I needed a unit to meet me at my address within the hour. The dispatcher asked if the individuals were still on the premises. I checked the camera feed, all 3 cars still in the driveway. I said yes. Then I told Clifford to drive. We came down the street slowly and parked 2 houses back. I could see Roland's car in the silver sedan in the driveway. A few minutes later, a patrol car turned onto the street. Sylvia's car came right behind it. I got out of the truck and walked up the driveway. Roland came out the front door about 30 seconds later with the folder under his arm. He saw me and stopped mid-step, his mouth open slightly. Whatever he had planned to say when he got back to the resort Sunday evening, whatever story he'd worked out, none of it applied anymore, and he knew it the second he saw my face. I didn't say a word. I held up my phone and pressed play on the footage. Roland at my kitchen table. Roland with the pen. Roland signing Howard Calloway in a house he thought was empty. 41 seconds, full screen, no sound needed. His face went still. Nadine came out behind him and stopped on the front step. She looked at Roland, then at me, then at the patrol car pulling up to the curb. She didn't move. She stood on the front step of the house where she grew up, where there's still a height chart penciled on the inside of the garage door frame. Her height at age 4, age 6, age 9, age 11. The last marked the year she decided she was too old for it. Lorraine wrote the dates in her handwriting next to each line. I've repainted that garage door twice. Never touched those marks. Nadine was looking at the ground. I stood 8 feet away from her and couldn't think of a single thing to say that would have mattered right then. The officers got out of the car. Sylvia was right behind them. I handed over my phone. Roland was arrested that afternoon. Forgery and attempted real estate fraud. His real estate license was suspended the following week pending the criminal investigation. The deed transfer had been void since January, the moment the irrevocable trust was filed. The property wasn't mine to sign away anymore. It belonged to the trust. Roland could have had a room full of notaries and a stack of paperwork a foot thick, and none of it would have moved that house 1 inch out of our names. Sylvia explained it to the officers, and later to the detective who came by that evening with a legal pad and a patient way of asking questions. The trust had closed the door before Roland ever picked up a pen. What the footage did was turn a civil matter into a criminal one. The notary cooperated fully. Turned out Roland had told him it was a pre-authorized transfer, that I had given power of attorney and simply couldn't attend in person. The notary had no reason to doubt that. He wasn't part of the scheme, he was lied to, which became its own problem for Roland on top of everything else. Nadine wasn't arrested. She was named in the civil suit Sylvia filed Monday morning, before Roland had even made his first call to a defense attorney. I don't know exactly what Nadine knew or when she knew it. The footage showed her standing at the window, with her back to the table the entire time. Maybe that means something, maybe it doesn't. I've thought about it more than I probably should. She called me 3 days after the arrest. Left a voicemail. I sat in the workshop and listened to it twice. She was crying, she said she was sorry. She said she didn't know it was going to go this far. That Roland had told her it was just paperwork, that they'd talk to me about it afterward, that I'd understand eventually. She said she should have said something sooner. She said she didn't know how to. I saved the voicemail. I didn't call back that day. I drove back to Indiana that same afternoon to get Lorraine. I didn't tell her on the phone, just said something had come up and I was on my way. She was quiet for most of the drive home. The highway was mostly empty. It was late afternoon and the light outside was going flat and gray the way it does in Ohio in early spring. That in-between light where winter isn't quite finished yet. About 40 minutes in, she asked me to tell her. So I told her everything, from the October phone call through the trust, the cameras, the hidden compartment in the workshop bench, the whole resort plan, all of it. I kept my eyes on the road and talked. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked out the passenger window for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "How long have you been carrying this by yourself?" I said about 14 months. She was quiet again. Then she said she wanted to see everything when we got home. The drawer, the documents, all of it. We pulled into the driveway just after 8. The porch light was on, it runs on a timer, and the house looked exactly the way it always looks when we come back from somewhere. Same gravel driveway. Same cedar mailbox I built from scrap wood in 1995 because I didn't like the one that came with the property. Lorraine walked in ahead of me and stopped in the kitchen doorway. She stood there for a moment looking at the white oak table. She walked over and put her hand flat on the surface, just held it there. Then she said, "Show me the workshop." We went out back together. Cold, clear night. The kind where you can see every star if you look up. I pushed open the workshop door and the overhead light buzzed on. The smell of sawdust and linseed oil, same as always. I walked her to the main bench and showed her the 2 spots on the base cabinet you press at the same time. The latch clicked, the false front swung open. She looked at the document box. She looked at the burner phone in its sleeve. I took out the box and set it on the bench and opened it. Showed her the trust documents, the deed, Sylvia's letter. She read the letter slowly, all the way through. When she got to the part that explained the deed transfer was void before Roland ever signed it, that the trust had already made it legally impossible months earlier, she stopped and read that paragraph again. She looked up at me and said, "So even if you hadn't come back, even if no one had stopped him, it still wouldn't have worked," I said. "Not even a little." She stood there for a minute, then she said she understood why I hadn't told her. She said it made sense, knowing how I think. But she said going forward, she wanted to know, she wanted to be part of it. I told her there won't be a next time. She said, "I know." But still, I put everything back in the box. We stood in the workshop a while longer, not talking much, just standing in the space I'd built 30 years ago with the same hands that built the house and the table and the garage door, with the height chart still penciled on the inside. Nadine at 4, at 6, at 9, at 11, Lorraine's handwriting next to every mark. We updated the will in April. Roland and Nadine are excluded. A portion of the estate goes to an organization in Columbus that helps older adults targeted by family financial fraud. Sylvia told me she'd never had a client respond to attempted theft by setting up a donation. I told her it seemed like the right thing to do with it. Nadine called again in May. We talked for about 20 minutes. No clean answers. She said she was done with Roland. I told her I hoped that was true. I told her I wasn't ready to talk about what comes next, but the door wasn't closed. That's where we left it. Most mornings I still walk through the house before Lorraine wakes up. Through the kitchen, out to the workshop, through the garage, onto the back porch. I look at the 1.8 acres. I look at the cedar mailbox. I look at the stone facade I laid in the fall of 1989, one course at a time. Everything I built is still here. People ask me how I knew to prepare that far ahead. I tell them I'm a contractor. I spent 28 years building things that had to hold weight long after I walked off the job. You don't build a load-bearing wall and hope it works. You build it to work. You plan for the pressure before it arrives. Roland forgot just one thing. He forgot that I built it. And everything I build to last. Real security isn't hoping nobody comes for what you built. It's making sure that by the time they try, There's nothing left for them to take. The house didn't survive because I fought for it. It survived because I protected it years before I needed to.